Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Seed to Harvest. Today I'm interviewing Jeanne Grosser. She's the head of America's Revenue and Growth at Stripe. Prior to joining Stripe, Jeanne was a CRO at Dialpad and spent over 7 years at Google prior to that. Jeanne, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Paige.
Absolutely. So I'd love to dive into it. When I was doing my research, I love this tidbit that I found. So this is from Jean's perspective for our listeners. I was interviewing at Google for this to be launched product, Gmail. They literally had to send me an email invitation to my AOL account. And I believe often when people think of companies like Google or Stripe, they may think of massive enterprises, but you were there in the early days of growth at both. So can you give us a bit of context into what it was like to sell Gmail as a product in the early days? I heard there was a wait list, but would love to hear more about what that process was like.
Yeah. So let me take a step back and say one thing first. So I joined Google at 2,000 employees, and I joined Stripe at 400 employees. And I think one of the things that a lot of people get wrong about startups is a lot of folks would have looked at those two companies and been like, oh, gee, you joined those super late. When I left Google, I had been at Google for longer than 99.6% of the current employee base. And I haven't looked up Stripe, but I'm pretty sure I've been in these here longer than 99% of the company now as well. So that's like one quick plug I will make is that when really world-class companies, it's often really never too late. And there's a ton of potential there. But sort of going to back to your question on Gmail. So I technically wasn't selling Gmail. That was another thing I learned on my first day on the job. So I had meant to get into sales because my father had worked in tech and sales. But when I showed up to work on Gmail, I was actually working in the support organization. And so it was my job to mostly reply to folks who were wondering whether or not Google was reading their email. Email at the time had launched the product without a contacts list. So imagine an email product with nowhere to store your contacts. So it was generally helping people understand that we didn't have that. And then actually, if you compare products today to back in 2004, when you launched a product in beta, I think it was legitimately in beta. So the number of bugs that we were troubleshooting was pretty significant. And so that was another big thing I was doing. Believe it or not, one of the top requested features, this would make probably a lot of people cringe, at the time was, can I get my Gmail into my Microsoft? And so that was another big job of mine was when you got your Gmail piped into Outlook, it often broke. And so diagnosing why it was that, your mail wasn't flowing through Outlook. So lots of fun times.
Yeah, it sounds like quite the experience. I want to dive a bit deeper into one of the instances where you had a massive Gmail outage and you were doing a post-mortem and only engineers and SREs were invited to this meeting. You weren't invited, but you showed up and no one knew who you were. And 20 minutes in, you raised your hand and were like, hey, I would love to talk about what happened from a user perspective. And then that became part of the standard postmortem approach. And part of your advice to folks in Dalian's Operator podcast, which I'll link in the show notes, was don't let your job description define your job. And I would love for you to speak to other examples of this in your career, because as my understanding, this is a resounding theme for you.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that's been true about how I approach my job is the job I'm given has a lot of, problems in order to do it well. And a lot of times I don't own necessarily the solution to that problem, but that doesn't mean I can't pretty aggressively influence it. So in the example you gave, when Gmail would have a massive outage, 10,000 people would write us in the support organization in a matter of 15 minutes. And there were 15 people on that team. So you could imagine what that would do to you. We wouldn't be able to get back to these Gmail users for days because the backlog was so bad. And so part of the reason I showed up at that meeting was I figured that it was possible that no one in the engineering team understood what was actually happening when we would have a Gmail outage. And so the only way that I was going to run a support team effectively was if we could stop that type of stuff. And so I've done a number of those things throughout my career. Another example, it's probably one of my prouder moments at Google, and it's also related to Gmail outages. So, backend infrastructure has matured a lot since the mid 2000s. But Gmail went through a phase where, we were scaling rapidly and it did go down relatively frequently. And as we launched Gmail for work, that became a real problem because now it wasn't just Jean's consumer account, right? It was her, her work email. This is going to be crazy to people because it's so standard now. But there was no such thing as system status pages back in, let's call it 2007. And so, I thought, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could just have a page on the internet that when Gmail went down, we would tell people, we know it's down. Like you don't have to let us know. We actually do know. And we're working on it. And like maybe here's an ETA for when it might be back up. And then this was actually a novel concept in 2007. And so I went and I pitched it to the SVP of engineering. And he thought it was a great idea, but there was no one to work on it. And so I went and Google is known for 20% time at the time. And so I found a passionate designer. His name is Braden. He and I are still in touch. And a long tenured Gmail engineer. I just said, would you use your 20% time to develop this status page, prototype with me? And so we all went and did that. And now, that's a standard at Google. And I think there's actually an entire company that does nothing
Yeah,
but
I was gonna say there's an entire, like, massive company that does that. That's super cool that you were involved in the earliest days of that. And then you have a couple examples from Stripe as well.
Yeah. So at Stripe, maybe I'll give you two. So one was, again, so I run sales, but if I'm going to help Stripe make as much as money as possible, we need really good demand. So marketing needs to be done well. And at the time I joined, we had one marketer who is awesome. She's actually still at Stripe. She's been here even longer than I have. And, but I don't think we were like used to bringing products to. And so again, not really my job to do marketing, but I could see a lot of holes in our launch process. And so I showed up to a meeting. I think I might have been invited to this one, and I brought a launch checklist with me and said, hey, based on my experience, like these are typically the 40 things that you would do if you wanted to launch a product effectively. Would you all be on board with maybe attempting, I don't know, at least 32 of them? And for a while, that spreadsheet became sort of our standard for product launches. Krithix is that marketer I was referencing. And I think she mentioned that she randomly stumbled across it sort of 6 years later, a couple of weeks ago. And then the other example I would give was similarly. So again, if you want to help drive revenue from a sales perspective, you probably want really well optimized pricing. So I don't want to spend 6 months selling to a company and then leave a bunch of money on the table because we haven't priced effectively. And so similarly, Stripe, at the time, we didn't have a pricing team. And we actually were having a situation where customers of ours were wanting to be repriced, basically have their fees lowered. And when we would investigate them to figure out whether we could offer a discount, we figured out that in a lot of their cases, we were actually paying them to use Stripe because their underlying fees were super, super high.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And so, we kicked off this major investigation that ultimately turned up that actually Stripe just didn't understand how a lot of things worked in our payments industry. And there were a bunch of things we weren't appropriately taking into account in the way we priced our core product. And we made a bunch of changes that, not only drove a lot more revenue for Stripe, but also let us price the broader user base a lot more fairly.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting what a dramatic shift that just changing the pricing strategy of a company can have. You're not making any changes to how the sales org is structured, literally just the pricing. It can have a dramatic impact on the business. Was that the switch to kind of like per transaction, like more aligned to that?
No, so Stripe actually had that out of the gates. So that was a core innovation, sort of like
Mhm.
6 lines of code, self-serve sign up, and then super straightforward pricing. This was more, it's sort of like payments geekery, but there were certain underlying costs that we probably needed to pass through a little bit better in some cases to better optimize for everybody else.
Cool. Yeah. And as you progress through your career, you mentioned in previous interviews that you aspired to be ultimately a global leader. And when you looked at global leaders or role models, one of the things that you were surprised by is how few of them actually had international experience. So you thought it was really important to go and have that experience so that you could have appropriate empathy for what it means to work outside of headquarters and internationally. So can you touch more on your experience globally? And specifically, I'm curious to hear more about how you learn to adjust to operate across different cultures.
Yeah, I really can't encourage folks more to go have an international experience. So I spent a year and a half in APAC while I was at Google. So, good example. So while I was out there was we actually ran all the bulk of Australia, New Zealand, and then Asia sales out of Sydney because it was an inside sales team. And then we had a team up in Japan. And when I went up to meet the team in Japan, it was, like super obvious to me that it just wasn't functioning well. And, so I talked to all of them individually, sort of like trying to figure out what exactly was going on. I think I got good insight into some of the problems. And then I decided to solve them in a very American way, which was basically like, I have an intervention where I lock everyone in a room. I'm going to be like, here's what I'm hearing from you all. Like, let's have it out, let's discuss it, get it on the table, and let's problem solve. So I go to do this and it's just like absolutely crickets, and I'm like, oh God, I don't know what to do. Like,
Oh no.
and I just like, I keep trying to like get people to say some of the things they said to me. I try to frame things differently. I tried different prompts to like make it a little bit, gentler to have a discussion. And it went absolutely nowhere. And so finally, we wrapped this meeting up early, and one of the guys on the team comes up to me afterwards and pulls me aside, and he's like, "I think I know what you were trying to do there." He's like, "But that's not how we're going to do things in Japan. We're very much more indirect about these, and so if you really want us to have that heart to heart type of conversation, you need to take us out to dinner." And we need to go drink together because that
Love
way it's
that.
actually a word in Japan that means like communicating while drinking, which basically like enables people to like more directly say what they think because you can always blame it on like, oh, I had one too many beers. And so, that was like just a massive learning of like, okay, my style isn't gonna work here. And I've got to be different if I want to be so that was a big insight. I think the other things I really like gained good perspective on um, was, one, particularly for the APAC region, but like the time zone stuff is just real rough, right? So
Mhm.
you're either going to be left out of the room or you're going to take meetings at times of the day that are challenging, right? So I, for a year and a half, every Wednesday did a forecast call at 5 a.m. and every Thursday did a staff meeting at 4 a.m. And I did that because I refused to be left out of the room. But I only had to do that for a year and a half. A lot of people, that is actually their life, to take meetings at 10 p.m. or at 6 p.m., 6 a.m. And so now I do a really good job. I'm on a global team. So I have a counterpart in India, I have a counterpart in APAC. And as an example, the three of us did our one-on-one and I take that call at 6 o'clock in the morning so that I also shoulder the burden. And it's not just, everything revolves around headquarters. And then maybe the last thing I took away from that experience is like, there's just nothing better than ultimately having people experience things firsthand. So, I could write up, a zillion page analysis of, what's different about APAC, why things would be a certain way. Or I could have like my boss come out for a week and go meet a bunch of customers and actually experience it. And so that was one of the other things I feel like I took away too, is just sometimes people have to experience it for themselves.
I love that. I think it's been interesting, like, being in COVID. My professional life is basically, like, started and continues to be during this period, and I'm really excited for the period where things are more opened up and I can get a sense for that. But at Dialpad, you were brought in as the CRO and you helped them grow 4x year over year. And you also had the opportunity to participate in driving the Series C investment there. So, one of the things that I think a lot about as an investor is the immense effort to translate what a business is building to employees, investors, and customers, and how fundraising can be helpful to hone that vision since you're repeating the pitch to so many folks and you kind of have to pick which pieces work and throw out the ones that don't. Can you speak a bit to what you learned during that process specifically?
Yeah, I mean, exactly what you said about you have to, hone things after every single pitch. And the same is true in sales. So I remember the first meeting we went to, we'd practiced before we went to any of these meetings. And I felt like we had a really tight narrative. The objections that we got I did not anticipate. And in particular, so the Dialpad, the product, so when we raised our Series C, we had just brought the main product, which was a cloud-based communication system to market in beta like a couple weeks. And we'd had this, it was really interesting. So we launched what we thought would be an S&B product. And in the first couple of days, had 10,000 person companies calling like our inbound phone number. And so just like super caught off guard with like, wow, okay, turns out there's a total unmet need in just like enterprise cloud community. And so we rapidly adjusted the pitch actually to incorporate that because it was pretty compelling. But it turns out a lot of VCs are, once upon a time were operators at companies that sold into large enterprises. And so like the level of sophistication of questions I got around like, oh, cute, you got some phone calls from some enterprises, like what's your actual enterprise go to market, and really wanting to click multiple layers deep. I think in the first meeting, I probably like was reasonably credible on like, okay, the first set of objections, right? But then when you got the second and third, you realize you rapidly were going to have to try to start anticipating some of these and get a good answer and not just think on your toes. So that was really useful. And so, Craig and I, the founder, after every call or meeting, we debrief. We'd always change a slide or two. We let each other know which question we handled it effectively. We'd role play the next one, et cetera. Because a lot of them you had to go back again, right? Like they'd be interested conditionally and they'd want to meet with you a second time. And so, you go tighten up the story around those. Same thing's true in sales too. Rarely do you nail a pitch the first time.
Yeah, it's super interesting, especially coming out of the gate of the beta and like having all of this excitement around what you're building and the inbound interest you are getting and coming to investors who are ready for the pitches and like dug really deep on that third level of questions about enterprise sales, which was probably a bit further off in your vision of the company. I think that's like really interesting. What were like some of the other common rebuttals that you heard and had to adapt to?
The other one was like we built a pretty robust like revenue model, and so people would really dig into the assumptions because like they weren't data backed at that point, right? And so really trying to figure out the degree to which that was credible, why you picked that number. Did you have any other proxies or reasons to believe that that might be true? So that was a big one. I think the other thing, on some level, I think we maybe did ourselves a disservice by having a relatively strong point of view on our go-to-market out of the gates, because then there was a little bit more to like poke on rather than being like, here's our super compelling product with a large market opportunity. So, it was interesting because a lot of the questions were pretty darn deep on the go-to-market piece, which I think was trying to like disentangle was there a there behind our enterprise thesis.
That's so interesting. Even at Series C, I feel like it's a theme that I've seen in investing is it's more like if you present traction numbers, folks will dig really deep into those. And if you're focusing more on like the long-term vision of the business and like the massive opportunity, then folks will spend a lot more time there versus like digging into the traction numbers. It's interesting that that carried like all the way through different stages of fundraising. I wanted to touch on something one of my other favorite stories that I had or heard about. So one of my favorite learnings as a developer success engineer at WorkWest is that people actually respond really well when you let them know that your product won't be a fit. In fact, they often evangelize it to other companies who they think it might be a better fit for. And you had a similar experience. So in your second week on the job at Dialpad, you flew to Schaumburg, Illinois, and tried to sell a 20,000 person global company on literally Slack. And probably a month in, you had to sit down with them and say, I'm really excited. You guys are excited about our product. I think we'll never sign this contract. We don't have the legal and security constructs that I know you're going to want as a traditional enterprise, and we're not going to be able to have them. And we should talk about that now because it won't change. You're either going to have to get past that, or we should probably call it a day. And I really respect that choice of yours and that that was the story that you told. Can you speak to what happened in the process after that?
Yeah. So the reason I did that also was, you're at a startup, like burn rate matters. And this was sucking up all of our resources. Like I was flying there, our founder would fly with me sort of like every other time. So I couldn't go spend 9 months trying to sell this deal because that's how long selling a 20,000 person company was going to take to ultimately not get a deal done, right? Like this was going to like make or break. We need to move on with our lives and go sell a bunch of mid-market companies, right? Or we need to land this thing and have it see, trajectory changing. So one of the things I got taught early in sales is yeses are great, nos are great, maybes will kill you. And so I just wanted to get myself out of maybe land as fast as possible. And because even if I got told, no, you're right, like there's no way we'll sign this deal without this specific security, agreement, then I could at least get the security addendum up front, right? And we could take that back internally and say, how much of this can we meet, et cetera. So I basically wanted to try to get every possible objection out on the table so that we could rapidly determine whether or not it would be something we want to do about while we're still at sort of the 50-yard line rather than being at, the goal line. So, and then similarly, what happened was exactly what you said. Like basically, the guy in IT that we were working became our evangelist, and he was like, I'll get you through security, right? Like, and I'm not going to say we didn't build a bunch of stuff along the way. Like, we ended up having to build out all of the like executive assistant transfer functionality, as an example, was like a total deal breaker. But there are a bunch of things that like we really had no business doing that deal that we got done, and then it takes a while to implement so you could continue to build things while they were working on going live. So, I definitely, for folks in sales, like always encourage you to be upfront, get the yes or get the no, because then you have something you can do, you can do something about rather than, hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, 100%. My journey in fundraising has been very similar. The maybes will definitely kill you, especially if you think that they're leaning towards yes and you've invested a lot in that and then it ends up being a no. So I think like one of the dynamics at play there is I think a lot about input metrics. And from listening to past interviews with you, it seems like you have a deep affinity for funnel math. And one of the guys on your team jokes about the Jeanne version of conjoined triangles of success. So can you talk a little bit about how you built out that funnel map from scratch when you joined Stripe?
Yeah. Yes, people like to give me a hard time with this. So I presented a slide at our kickoff that was basically like an equation, but with, highly memorable graphics. But that's where people started giving me a hard time about conjoined triangles. But anyway, basically my point of view on funnel math is if you want to hit your goal, you probably need to know what needs to be true in order to get there. And so if you've actually done the math or build what I call an operating model, so basically if you want $10 million, how many leads are you going to need? At what rate are those going to convert to opportunities? At what rate are you going to win them? How long is it going to take you to win them? What's going to be the average deal size? Like all that math. Then you can lay that out and upfront ask yourself, what's the probability that this would be true? Where are you most likely to be weak within that equation? And then as you go start executing, you can start to backfill real data and figure out where it's diverting from what you thought might be true. So this was actually one of the first things I did at Stripe when I came in was go and build that out. And one of the things that helped me realize actually was, Stripe had very strong growth aspirations and that the organic inbound demand that we had was not going to grow at the rate we were going to need to support sort of the top of funnel of that equation. And so about 4 months into my tenure at Stripe, we started figuring out, okay, how do we go about doing more outbound prospecting, and also if we can't change that dramatically, then what can you do to increase your average deal size, et cetera. And so, at my kickoff, basically some of this would be like, here are our levers. Like as a sales organization, you want to own your own destiny and what we're going to do to pull each of the levers along that funnel.
Love that. And one of the risks specifically with enterprise sales is that you can create this bifurcation between the sales organization and the product organization, where the product team gets annoyed, basically that sales is signing these super attractive deals and you don't actually have the product for them. So how do you ensure that you're pursuing the enterprise market together?
Yeah, you need on this has to be in the same boat. So when we started looking at this from a Stripe perspective, there were a couple things that we did that I think worked well. So one, you do need the leadership team to be bought in. So, we made sure that John and Patrick saw the opportunity with these large deals and they themselves wanted them. In the case of Stripe, At the time, companies like Shopify were rapidly growing up on Stripe and becoming public companies. And so we didn't want to churn them as customers. So frankly, the product strategy was going to have to evolve anyway to support them effectively. And if you're building more product for Shopify, you might as well sell that to others. And then the other thing we tried to do was we did a fair amount of work to analyze where are we strong today and where in the enterprise space do companies look most like that? So that you're going to sell something that maybe has 80% of today's functionality rather than only 20%. And so what we tried to do was basically pursue companies that were sort of like, one concentric circle from where we had product market fit today rather than being, totally left field. And that way you would always be pushing the envelope on your product roadmap, but you wouldn't necessarily be needing to go out and build an entirely, separate product side by side.
I love
So
that concentric circles idea. I think that it can be very exciting to pursue opportunities that are outside of focus areas. And I think that the focus on like one concentric circle outside of the existing product is really great. So there's a lot of product like growth companies out there building sales teams. And one of the other challenges that I've seen is educating a sales team, especially if there are large enterprise accounts that require ripping out existing software or very like complicated systems already in place. So, how do you think about educating a sales team, especially? I mean, specifically at Stripe, there's so many available ways that Stripe can help businesses grow. So, how do you think about educating a sales team? Because I think this is an area that not a lot of folks really invest time in, but it is super important.
yeah, it's incredibly important. And I think it would be fair to say, like at Stripe, I think we feel we underinvested. So what we did in the early days was we basically had an expectation within the sales org that everyone sort of took a page out of the Google book on like 20% time. So everyone was going to spend 80% of their time, doing everything in their power to drive as much revenue as possible. And then in 20% of your time, you were going to do projects to sort of raise the tide for all boats. So build the foundation for our organization. So some of our best sales reps, would go out, spend 80 to 100% of the time hitting their number, and then 20% of the time actually taking all the amazingness that was in their head and turning that into training materials or being spin up buddies for new hires, et cetera. And so that got us pretty darn far. And then, we had last year, as an example, we doubled the sales organization in a single year. And now we've moved into, basically sell into every segment from startups all the way to, global 2000 companies. And then we've also, Stripe's product suite is a lot broader. So we've got payments, we've got SaaS products, we've got banking as a service products, et cetera. So when that happens, there are a couple ways you solve for this. So one is as you mature, starting to increasingly specialize in terms of both function and segmentation. So from a function perspective, when I first joined Stripe, we only had account executives. There weren't sales development people, there weren't deployment folks, there weren't solution architects. A's did it all. And then now, we probably have 10 different types of functions across the sales org that are really good at the one part of the life cycle for that customer. Or similarly, right, when I first started, people would sell to a really big company in the morning and a small one in the afternoon. And we now, segment companies based on how big they are, but also maybe their business model or vertical so that the conversations that you're having start to be more similar and you get better pattern recognition.
Yeah, sounds like less context switching.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, both on the horizontal and vertical, as well as the aspect of. Well, yeah. I guess I'm curious if there's like specific training materials that go along with those different vertical or horizontal segments. Or sounds like spin up buddies was a tactic, but would love to hear more about strategies that you've seen be successful in educating and onboarding new sales reps.
Yeah. So I think there are two things is like we'll do core sales skills training. So arguably this training is totally transferable. We'll Stripeify it, right? So it's sort of like Stripe's methodology, but most of it is just core skills. And so you do that type of training to just up everybody's game, but also establish a common language for how you talk about a deal, the things that are going on in the deal, et cetera. And then you've got sort of much more Stripe specific content where I can teach you how to sell these 5 products to a fintech versus selling, these 4 products to a marketplace. And so that's also where, as you scale, working with your marketing organization, right? And you really build out a solution and then the end-to-end playbook of what are the discovery questions you should be asking? What's the first pitch deck versus some of the deep dive workshops? What are common objections and how can you codify and train people on that? So, now when we launch something, we'll do sort of like a full bill of materials, which is that all of that versus, when we used to bring these to market, you'd be lucky to get a pitch deck.
That's awesome. Yeah, definitely really great context to see as the sales organization develops and also doubles in growth over a year, how those training models shift to onboard great folks. So, one of Patrick Collison's particular academic interests is progress studies. And as outlined in the Atlantic op ed, which I'll link in the show notes as well, progress studies seeks to get better at knowing how to get better. And I have an inkling that you share this interest as well. And I'm curious what books or people have guided your learning journey along the way?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if there's like a specific one. I'm more of kind of, I just pluck little things from different places. So, but I feel like both, Google was a very analytical company and Stripe is as well. And one of the things both companies did well on this topic is being very hypothesis driven. So I think the best way to learn is to start by having had a point of view on what you think is likely to happen. That way, when something actually happens, you can go back and be like, well, how similar or different is that from what I thought was going to happen? Why is that similar or different? And what does that imply for what might happen next? So I think that's how, I always think about constant improvement and iteration is like, you can't really iterate if you don't have a strong sense of where you were coming from to begin with. And so that's very, I think Stripe continues to be very hypothesis driven.
I love that. Very like scientific approach to company building.
Yes.
Well, Jean, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it so much. And to close this out, do you have any additional things that you want to touch on? And then where can people find you on the internet?
Additional things. I mean, there are tons. I feel like all sorts of stuff. I'm having fun chatting about with folks. I actually just met with 12 startup founders about an hour ago to talk go to market. So it's always interesting to talk about how you hire your first sales lead. How as a founder you get comfortable with no longer being the person doing the bulk of the sales. There's a lot of talk going on right now. Consumption based business models and how that impacts pricing and sales motions, et cetera. So mostly, maybe I'd lead by saying I think it's like a super exciting time to be in go to market because there's so much change happening. And then where to find me on the internet? Well, I mean, people can also just like email me. I always am happy to be like, if you need help, like Stripe's like, we're very focused on helping startup founders. So I'm just Jeanne. I'm not a big Twitter person. So you can find, I think it's Jeanne DeWitt 29, but I wouldn't recommend DMing me. Maybe I guess from my Gmail days, I'm probably a little bit email centric even now. So feel free to shoot me a note.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And it was great to get to chat with you today.
Yeah, likewise, Paige. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks so much for tuning in today to Seed to Harvest. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever your favorite podcast listening platform is. I'll be releasing new episodes weekly, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know on Twitter. That's Paige Finn, Paige and then Finn with 3 N's. Thanks, and see you again next week.